We should probably get started, and I should add that
Sure.
Brandon very kindly has arranged to run the recording, which is going right now, and he will use IACM's account to transcribe it afterwards, which is, really the one of the long-term purposes of doing what we're doing, because we need to be able to demonstrate the ways in which our own thinking has been changing over the course of the discussions we've had. And that becomes a relatively simple output that we can put up as a Q&A on our webpage, and it's a bit more accessible than the first publication we put out there, which is a bit technical for a lot of people.
So am I off the hook with note taking?
You are off the hook officially, but if you find yourself jotting down things that are, that make an impression on you, that will flag for us what to edit, particularly for when we get the transcript, because the transcript will have to be turned from, spoken English into written English, which is something I've done lots before. So it's not a challenge, but being able to zero in on particular things that grabbed you could be helpful. So Barney, do you want to begin?
Let's kick off. Well, let's kick off. In my case, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure for me to moderate this session. I'll say something about myself in a moment, but let me just introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. We've got Cal Cal is senior partner with an outfit called Interventus Global. It's a consulting firm based in Vancouver and specializes in the human element of cybersecurity. I think pretty much the sort of thing that Anne is also doing. He has a long history in the security services, 33 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. After a number of years, or he was for a number of years their chief hostage negotiator. He concluded his career there leading a large unit combating transnational organized crime and money laundering. And he has been involved with this project from the start, together with Veronique, Andrea, Chris, and myself. Chris Corpora. Chris, we haven't met yet, but good to meet you virtually. Chris is Director of Strategy and Research at IN2 Communications, consulting firm which focuses particularly on Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Chris is based in Istanbul, previously professor of practice in intelligence studies at Mercyhurst University. Before that, he served with multiple US departments and agencies in security-related work, including with the US Department of State, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Department of Defense. John Gilmore. John, likewise, good to meet you virtually. He was employed for 37 years with Canada's federal government, most recently as the head of strategic planning and operational analysis in the counterterrorism division of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS. He is now focusing on academic pursuits, instructing on terrorism, counterterrorism, and intelligence issues at both Ottawa University and Carleton University. Chris, before I introduce you, if something goes wrong on my side, technically, would you mind just stepping in? I'll try and reconnect whenever I'm able to. Now, Chris,
Sure.
I think is known to all of you. Maybe superfluous to say, but he's a conflict managed consultant, has been for many years also mediator arbitrator based in DC, currently in West Virginia. Lucky you. He's served as director or co-director of a series of multinational research and development projects for more than 30 years, of which the best known to IACM members, of course, are the Canon of Negotiation Initiative and the Rethinking Negotiation Teaching Project. Anne is a senior managing consultant in cybersecurity at IBM, based at the Paris office. She's got previous experience in banking. Her focus is on helping international corporations, particularly financial services firms, keep pace with an ever-changing threat landscape. Her special interest, as I said, like Kel's, is in the human dimensions of cybersecurity. I'm based in Brussels Belgium at the moment, from South Africa originally. I'm a professor at Cleary Business School teaching negotiation. I've been involved in mediation and negotiation consulting work for many years as well. So thank you very, very much for attending. We thought that we'd like you to keep your questions until the end, but please feel free in the meantime to use the chat. If you want to park any questions, I'll try and keep up with those as we go along. But we'd like to get through the presentation, the discussion first, and then open it up to the floor. I did write to the panelists to say time is tight, so I'm going to try and be as efficient as possible as far as timekeeping is concerned, and I may rudely interrupt the speakers from time to time, just for the sake of time. So forgive me for that, please. Chris, if I may start with you, if you don't mind just first of all giving us a brief background about this project, which really emanated from you and Cal Christie.
Sure. So what we are doing here is an interdisciplinary and multinational effort to understand gray zone conflict or hybrid warfare. In the long term, we hope to help devise methods of mitigating harm. But the immediate priority is just to understand it. It's a phenomenon that's pretty clearly proliferating, but it's designed to be as murky as possible. So the project is named after the ancient Egyptian goddess of knowledge. The group as a whole now consists of about close to 50 people. Roughly 40 of them are experts in negotiation from many domains, some practical, some scholarly. But along with that, we have 8 experts in security, 4 of whom have joined us today. And they too cover many kinds of experience. Right now, we have membership from 9 countries. The project is conceptually related to the Wicked Problems Working Group, which was an influential group within the Rethinking Negotiation Teaching Project some years back. Gray zone conflict clearly has all the hallmarks of a wicked problem, including the central characteristic that it resists definition. There's a lot more on this in 2 volumes of the Rethinking Negotiation Project book series. And if anybody was in the previous session, I would just point to this book, which is volume 4, because there was some discussion in the previous session of the problems of teaching about wicked problems. And there are 2 of the chapters that we have on wicked problems in this volume are about teaching. One is teaching 3-dimensional negotiation to graduate students, which is by Jane Doherty of Eastern Mennonite University, along with Calvin Krusty, who's here. And the other it was called Teaching Wickedness to Students. And its authors include Roy Lewicki, who is also here, along with Sanda, who's here, and Jim Coben, who is not. And both of these were highly interdisciplinary in their approach, and I think they are streets ahead of anything else I've seen on teaching. Furthermore, I'm happy to say, we had grant money to make those books free in PDF, and you can get anything that's in those books via convenor.com, which also has a web page on this project. Okay.
Chris, can I ask you? Okay, so the project itself is one issue. There's the so what question. What is our interest in cyber warfare, in hybrid warfare, in gray zone conflict? What is the negotiation angle on all of that?
Okay, where this comes from is that Calvin was influential in the Wicked Problems team. He was then chief hostage negotiator for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Later on, he became, he was charged with running what was a rather large team combating money laundering and transnational organized crime, in which his base city of Vancouver had turned out to be one of the world's hotspots. And Calvin ran that team for several years. If I can speak for you, Calvin, briefly. You can say more later. And then retired from the RCMP. And sometime after he retired, close to 2 years ago now, Calvin got back in touch with me and basically told me that he had left his office with some regrets as to the status of our understanding of the threats, and some regrets as to what anybody was being able to do about them. And he thought that the interdisciplinary approach that we had used and that he had been part of might allow for a fresh approach to all this. And that really is what started this project. We have since accumulated a wonderful team of people. And I'll move on from that to saying why we think that negotiation is a good lens for thinking about gray zone conflict or hybrid warfare. And that's basically traceable back to one of the foundational insights of our field by Morton Deutsch way back during the Cold War. That conflict provided outstanding examples every week for serious researchers to think about how major conflict operates. And Mort Deutsch, who I'm happy to say before he died wrote for us a number of times, so we had some truck on this stuff. Way back when I was a baby, he was writing about the way conflict actually worked and the way negotiation actually worked, and came up with the insight that there was no such thing as a relationship which didn't include elements of both cooperation and competition. And this included relationships that most people thought of as purely competitive, such as the Soviet Union and the US. There were clear examples of cooperation, even at that time, between those adversaries. And that was an incredible insight that led to an enormous amount of work that some of you are more familiar with than I am. But the need to cooperate internationally on some things, climate change being an obvious example, stands even while the West competes with the same countries. Or in a more anodyne formula, you could say, even while we have to protect ourselves against strongly competitive behavior by them. Obvious examples in recent weeks and months include ransomware attacks that are state-supported or state-tolerated by the states where the ransomware groups are housed, or election interference. And there have been plenty of others that we will probably get into shortly. We are going to have dealings with Russia and China, whether some politicians and voters like it or not. And we think that fundamentally people who study and practice negotiation at a sophisticated level deal with that cooperation and competition balance all the time. Some of them have also developed strong patterns of working across disciplines. And those two factors together, we think, make negotiation a good lens to address this phenomenon. And in fact, I have yet to see offered by anybody a better lens to address this. But I will say that there are still lots of people whose default mode is to think that all of this is the business of the security services and not something that the rest of us need to bother with. And I think that the four people that we've been able to draw with security backgrounds today are in an outstanding position to discuss that. And I think you can draw your own conclusions from what they say.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, great. Thanks very, very much. Veronique, just some background on where the project fits into the Institute for Negotiation Innovation.
Thank you, Barney. So Project SEICHAT is hosted by a nonprofit organization, which is the Institute for Negotiation Innovation. Some of you have heard about its beginning in a conference about 2 years ago. So it has still been developing. So it has been officially incorporated as a nonprofit organization in the Greater Montreal in Canada. a few months ago. Barney, Andrea, Chris, and me are all members of the board of the INI. It is also co-sponsored by 2 universities, so by the Faculty of Law of the University of Sherbrooke, which is my university, and Blurick Business School, which is Barney's university, so both one in Canada and one in Belgium. One impressive fact is the amount of support that we have been gathering. We have gathered a team of more than 100 collaborators within the past year, comprising both academics, practitioners, trainers from all sectors of activities and negotiation in 27 countries and covering 5 continents. Its mission, it's also actively supported by 11 partner universities across the world. One of our observations in building this organization has been that the field of negotiation has been significantly underfunded, either by academics, trainers, practitioners. So for that reason, we're seeking initially $5 million US in the first 5 years from different sources. So either corporate, governmental, charitable sources. And so far, we have been able to gather more than $120,000 US in private funding. So this is where we stand right now. Just a few words about its mission. So its mission is to be able to improve negotiation capacity for business, government, and other stakeholders in society. Currently, it has 4 strategic orientations. The first one is to conduct multidisciplinary, theoretical, and also empirical negotiation research at the global scale. The second one is to develop practical, open access, research-based online resources to assist negotiators. One of our projects is developing an online negotiation assistant, which would comprise a huge database that is searchable, that is aided by artificial intelligence. The third strategic orientation is to contribute to the advancement of knowledge in negotiation and its wide dissemination. So open source is an important keyword and mission of the organization. And it's also to encourage significant financial and human investment in scientific research in negotiation. Like Chris was mentioning, Project CECHAT is one of the first projects of the INI, so it will have different projects, but this is one of our first, with a multidisciplinary team of experts that we have gathered that are present today, including security experts, law professors, dispute resolution professionals, dispute resolution professors. One of its aims of Project CECHAT is to study negotiation techniques in the context of extreme competition, just like Chris was mentioning to you. So we believe that hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict will be a perfect case study application for that.
Oh, thanks very, very much indeed. Short and sweet. Thank you. I'm going to turn my attention to our 4 security experts, and I'll have 3 questions for you to begin with, and let me just run through them. The one is definitional. What's in a name? Some people refer to hybrid warfare, others refer to gray zone conflict. And my question to you will be, does it matter? Does it matter what we call it? The second will be, does a state actor have to be involved in order for certain actions to qualify as hybrid warfare or whatever one wants to call it? And the last thing I will ask you is, are there any particular effects of or activities relating to hybrid warfare that you find particularly interesting yourself? So let me start with the first question. And Anne, if I could kick off with you, as far as definitions are concerned, does it matter what we call this beast, whether it's hybrid warfare, gray zone conflict, or should we distinguish and find a more sharper definition of the topic that we're talking about?
So that's a great question, and it's one that we've talked about a lot. What I found the most interesting in the question of definition is that we've struggled to land on a single one, but I don't actually think it's a problem as such. What would be a problem would be being dogmatic and imposing one. What I found very interesting in this is that we've been debating it. and that we've forced ourselves to be intellectually very curious and exploring different definitions and entertaining the idea that even if we came into the discussion with a very clear-cut idea of what we thought it was, that the fact that there are multiple definitions shows that there are different priorities and that the language that's used shows focus. So the fact that there are multiple definitions for me is just, it's a symptom, an attribute of the complexity, sort of the wicked nature of this. And it would be, I think, a mistake too early on to be too dogmatic about the definition and lay down and say this is what it is, without exploring why other people think that it might be something different.
Okay, all right. Okay, great. Thanks very much indeed. Christopher Corpora, if I could ask you what your view is on that, please. Chris, can you hear us? He's still muted.
We may just momentarily have lost him. He was on video, he was just dropped off.
Okay. All right. John Gilmore, if I may turn to you, please.
Sure. Thank you, Barney. And again, a very good question. I guess when it comes to definitional issues, we've seen a lot of different people call it different things. Russians tend to call it non-linear warfare. Chinese call it unrestricted warfare. We've heard unconventional or non-conventional warfare. In my view, when you're looking at the different ways in which it's presented in terms of context, the main difference seems to be one that considers hybrid warfare consisting only of the soft power kind of influences, such as cyber warfare or media influence or something along those lines. But there's no integration with conventional warfare. Whereas the Russians, for example, when they talk about non-linear warfare or hybrid warfare, they're more than prepared to consider the use or the inclusion of conventional warfare within their definition of what hybrid warfare concludes or includes. So I agree with that. There is no one hard, fast, silver bullet definition, and there's probably no advantage to doing that. But in my view, that's the main difference that I've seen, and the concern on that is how you respond or how you design your defenses against that. If your defense is limited to soft power only, that's one thing. But in fact, your opponent is prepared to include conventional warfare as part of its broad definition of what hybrid constitutes. Then you're going to get a different response or a different means of engaging.
Thanks, John. Kel?
Yes, like the others, a great question, and one that has created a significant amount of dialogue that probably cannot be understated, the amount of dialogue that we've had relative to trying to ascertain say a group understanding of it, so that we were working off a similar platform and understanding in terms of what it was. But I think what we found in terms of the term hybrid warfare, asymmetrical warfare, unrestricted warfare, gray zone conflict, and several other terms, was the diversity, even using the same term, where different parties were coming up with different definitions. And as I think many within our group are aware of, we've tried to take a all-encompassing perspective of it for the purpose of this group, so that we can have a better understanding of all the possible implications it has relative to what we're talking about in terms of various forms of negotiation, various forms of conflict management, and how that has a cascading impact in terms of practitioners working in these particular fields. So I don't think we've landed on any clear acceptance of any meeting, which I think is just possibly for lack of a better term, the evolution of our understanding of it as practitioners and academics as well.
And I suppose the nature of the beast, being a wicked problem, hard to define, and views will differ. But Kel, staying with you, does a state actor have to be involved for it to qualify as hybrid warfare or whatever else one calls it?
Well, we're probably going to get a diversity of thoughts on this one, and I guess depending on what the intention of the definition is, but I find it useful, for the purpose of study, research, and understanding, to be inclusive of the state actors in the definition, to allow us to understand the broader possible activities associated to it and the broader risk associated to it.
Okay, so you would include a state actor. That for you is a clear yes, right?
Yes, for the purpose of the study.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you. John, what about you?
No, I would agree that the nature of the strategy of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, whether it's region specific like Russia and the Ukraine or broader agendas, I would agree that the degree of centralization and coordination of multiple communities to engage in the activity requires absolute central control from a state or from state authority to do it. That doesn't mean that non-state actors cannot be employed as part of the strategy. I mean, you've got Gazprom or the cyber criminals in the case of Russia, or you've got triads in the case of China. But absolutely, to engage in the coordination and the centralization of what's required to have a successful strategy, the role of the state is essential.
Okay, thank you. Anne, any views from your side?
I concur generally. My thoughts on this when I was first thinking about the question, yes, the state actor needs to be involved. And I just came across a podcast actually that threw out the idea that, well, what about in the case, for example, of drug cartels, and the sort of the locus of power in those situations. And it was an interesting aspect of the topic that I hadn't thought about. It still means a state actor is kind of involved. It's just that their power is not what it would be necessarily when we think about it. So the short answer is yes, for me, state actors are involved. There are layers to it, however, in terms of who holds the power in certain regions and in certain countries, that my lens as a cybersecurity practitioner, I hadn't thought about it like that. And that's where kind of the multidisciplinary nature of our working group is very valuable, because we kind of throw these ideas at each other that my normal frame of reference I wouldn't have seen.
Okay, all right. So in other words, a state actor, but it may include non-state actors as part of the broader strategy as well then. I'm going to leave the last question about which aspect of hybrid warfare you find most interesting yourselves for later, just for the sake of time. But Cal, can I ask you, how does hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict fit into the larger context, the current geopolitical situation? Just very briefly.
Real briefly, I think hybrid warfare is what we're seeing currently, in all social media, in all the headlines and activities, where, for lack of a better term, Western democracies in conflict geopolitically with other state actors like China, Russia, and Iran. And that cascades into a number of areas, from financial negotiations, political negotiations, diplomatic negotiations. So you're seeing that cascading not only in the higher strategic end type of disputes, but that even cascades often these geopolitical issues into your own communities.
Okay, all right. Kel, thank you. Chris, good to have you back. Just asking your view, do state actors have to be involved for something to qualify as hybrid warfare? I've got 3 yeses. Would you go with a yes, or would you say not necessarily?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's war itself requires, at least as we understand it in the modern era, requires a state some states' involvement. The interesting thing about what we're looking at is a new kind of surrogacy, if you will. This isn't just like, you know, secret wars during the Cold War. It's this, there's governments are, you know, many of the larger governments are outsourcing much of the work that that they have historically done within the government. That includes the U.S. government as well. So there's a whole, you know, sort of new ripple to this that makes this version of, you know, hybrid warfare, or whatever term we use, important. But state involvement, state interests are, you know, for the most part, always at play.
A good ingredient. Okay, thanks very much. Staying with you, Chris, and also with John. There's one view that says what we're talking about is something that belongs in the security arena. It's for security experts, the military, the intelligence agencies to worry about that. And the rest of us should really not be concerned about that. And the less we know about it, the better. Would you go along with that? Or do you think this is something that ought to be in the public domain as it is at the moment in our discussion, for example? Something that people outside of the agencies need to be concerned and investigate and research and comment on as well.
It's yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I think the question, as we've talked about it in the past, maybe my answer was misunderstood, but certainly there should be interest. But if there's an expectation of states to share their information or their ideas around this, that's kind of naive, right? I mean,
of course.
Yeah. So I mean, but it's absolutely important for all sorts of many different types of professionals to be interested in this, because it cuts so broadly across sort of socioeconomic, you know, reality that we live in, and you know, and the political obviously is a part of that.
Yeah. Okay, John, your views on that?
Well, I guess from an intelligence perspective, of course, the role of intelligence is always to determine where the elements of hybrid warfare are occurring, and if specific sectors are at risk of being threatened or targeted, so they can develop an appropriate response. But I think on top of that, most of the targets of hybrid warfare largely fall within the commercial and private domains right now. So an effective response to hybrid warfare requires not really even a whole of government response, but it's a multi-sector response. And supporting what Chris says, I think it's necessary that intelligence agencies and civilian leadership explain in the clearest possible terms the nature of possible threats. For example, there could be a need for public information campaigns about how disinformation works. Those kinds of things are absolutely required in order to foster more critical thought towards messages that are being directed towards the public as part of broader hybrid campaigns. So it's, in my view, it's no longer an intelligence or even a whole of government response is required. It's a whole of sector response. And that includes the sharing of information to the degree that you can. Obviously, there are sensitivities from an intelligence perspective of, you know, divulging sources.
Of course.
And historically, there's always been a challenge of sharing information with frontline responders who aren't cleared to operate stuff. But that's something that's fixed. But it's a multi-sectoral response now, not just government, nor not just intelligence.
Yeah, and then of course that provides a real challenge to states, right? Because states don't historically interact well with other sectors, especially when we talk about intelligence and security. Indeed. Right. So it's a very difficult, it's a culture shift.
Yeah. And do both of you think that Western agencies, assuming this is, you know, looking at it just only from a Western perspective, of course, and we'll come back to the question whether that is the right attitude to look at it only from that perspective, but are the Western agencies able to cope with the threat? If one looks at the papers and look at all the cyber attacks, I certainly sometimes get the feeling that we might not all be that well equipped to actually deal with this. Or do you think that is scaremongering?
Well, I think there's a lot to learn. I think there's a lot of change that needs to occur. It's, you know, there certainly states aren't up to countering this quite the way that that maybe we expect them to. But I think the other side of this too is that there's sometimes competing interests too, because all states are involved in some aspects of this, including, you know, the U.S. and others, right? They're involved in promoting their own interests, right? And so, I mean, there are certain laws and certain things that stand in the way of doing certain types of activities in Western states that aren't there for more authoritarian states. But that's really more about the logic of what, you know, of the logic of how you know, we understand our society, right? I mean, it's almost like a disconnect. I mean, these authoritarian states, they're there to preserve their power, you know, not to preserve the interests of their citizens, but the interests of the power that they hold, right? So there's a logic there, but it's a completely different logic than what we're used to. So I mean, this has been a problem with all sorts of, you know, criminal activities in the sort of, you know, included, right? So transnational organized crime, you know, the modern policing is, you know, oftentimes a step behind, right? You know, because of the breadth of the activities, and because of the abilities of because of sometimes the shackling of police authorities, especially on the Western side, with different rules and regulations, right? So those rules and regulations don't pertain to, you know, criminal actors, right? Or those who choose to organize themselves using different rules, right? So it's almost like playing two different games at the same time, and you know, it's very easy to get lost.
One with the hands tied and the other, But I suppose it might reinforce the case for what John calls a whole of sector response, and not just put all responsibility on governments to try and cope with the threats. John, any views from your side on that question, whether Western agencies are well equipped to deal with the threats?
I guess I look at it from three different circles. First of all, I think intelligence agencies or national security agencies or law enforcement agencies are probably best positioned to identify how diaspora from a particular nation may be supporting hybrid activities of a state that's you know, undertaking the nature of the hybrid attack. So I think something like that is probably best suited for intelligence or law enforcement agencies. When it comes to disinformation campaigns, that is something that intelligence or law enforcement agencies can work in partnership with media outlets, whether they're social media or whether it's conventional media. I think there's greater opportunity there. When it comes to cyber attacks, I think that's where private sector or commercial interests, through osmosis or evolution, have sort of assumed the leadership in identifying and countering cyber attacks. They are always leagues ahead of public sector when it comes to, at least when it comes to identifying or responding. And that's where most of the attacks are taking place right now, in all honesty. So it's sort of a phased approach, but I think intelligence or law enforcement agencies from the government certainly have a critical role when it comes to identifying or ensuring that private sector companies have the ability to identify threats and to train against threats.
Okay, but which is a perfect point at which to move to Anne, and that's pretty much your business, right? Cyber threats and how in your experience do those impact negotiations? For example, decisions on whom we even deal with, issues of confidentiality, strategy, ethics, and so on.
Absolutely. So when my comments, I sort of preface it by saying this is not linked to my employer, right? Just in general, what I've seen in the private sector is, I'd actually go a step further than what John was saying, is that it's not that we need just a sectorial response. We need private sector leadership to contribute to almost whole of nation responses. And one of the things that concerns me about the private sector is that while there is definite sophistication and expertise and an ability to arguably detect and respond to threats faster than the public sector, I worry about the incentives, and I worry about how the private sector frames the issue. We have a tendency, at least what I've seen, is we have a tendency to look at cyber attacks in isolation. At best, we might look at a series of attacks as a campaign, but we very rarely take a step back and say, what might this be executed in the service of? And that's where the frame of reference of the public sector and the intelligence agencies is extremely important, because corporations, and particularly large corporations, are beholden to their shareholders. And we function on a quarterly basis, and we mitigate immediate risks. Whereas there is an aspect to the hybrid, the gray zone conflict, which is very long-term campaigns of attrition with potentially barely visible effects if you're looking at them on a quarterly basis. And what I wonder about the private sector is, will a category of leaders emerge spontaneously because it's the right thing to do? Will the public sector, and notably government, have to intervene and, I was about to say, push, urge, coerce action through legislation, so that there is a different type of behavior? Because left to its own devices right now, there is some change. Is the pace of change adequate? I don't see corporations integrating the potential threat to national security into their decision-making mechanisms unless there is external influence coming from a government, for example.
Okay. Which I think nicely leads into my question for Chris and Kel. From your vantage point, do you think that business understands the interconnectedness between the various forms of activity, or are they, as Anne says, so focused on dealing with one issue at a time that they don't see the bigger picture, the whole systemic aspect of hybrid warfare? Kel, what's your view?
Well, I would say not only businesses, when I look at the key stakeholders and go back to the original discussion that Chris Honeyman and I had at the outset, we looked at lawyers, business persons being almost the first responders in many of these disputes that we were seeing in this area in terms of financial takeovers, etc. But do they have an understanding? I don't think the public sector has an understanding. If you talk to people in the military professional area, they look at it, historically through terrorism and other aspects of it. They weren't really looking at how transnational organized crime was connected to it. Then you get the cyber people looking at it through, the technical lens, and even they don't look at it sometimes through the human element lens and with the lens of going, well, this is actually a criminal activity, and where's all the money going and what is it being used for? So to answer your question, I don't think the public sector nor the private sector has a complete understanding of it. And I highlight for those that are really interested in it, I think it was well documented in a paper from Georgetown University called Discourse, Dissent, and Strategic Surprise, written by Nolan. And he really talked about some of these emerging threats, although this has been around for a while, and how problematic it is for leaders to grasp the complexity of them. And I really encourage people to take a look at that, because I think it really highlights both the psychological challenges associated to it and some of the conflicting objectives and policy impediments to responding to it as well.
All right. So you're saying it's not just business that are focused on individual aspects of the cyber or the hybrid warfare threat. It's sometimes the agencies themselves, right?
Yeah,
Don't see the whole picture.
I think, the mind always, shifts to the simplicity in terms of looking at things often more in a linear way, because it's probably an easier to process and to understand. But I think in this particular case, complexities and the interconnectivities of the activities, I think, is critical to understand if one is to have any success in terms of being effective or efficient in terms of dealing with these issues in a dispute situation or in a negotiation process.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more than what, and just piggybacking on what Calvin's saying, it's an institutional issue. I mean, not only like, the rules are different, as I tried to allude to earlier, but there's an institutional problem here. We've gone to almost hyper specialization, especially in the West, and this is but technology has gone to being available to a broader and broader set of people, right? So we don't have really solid generalists anymore, and especially in government. This is just to the government problem, right? I mean, everyone has, and a lot of this is really around your budget stream. I work for Agency X, and Agency X is funded to do this. And so that's where the focus is. And even if you are interested, or you do see this connection points, it's very difficult, even in the era of, all the talk of interagency cooperation and all this, it's come very hard. It hasn't, certainly in the US, it's come very, very hard. I can't speak for the Canadian experience, but getting to your initial question, which is the private sector, I mean, the issue really here is their interest, right? I mean, and Anne's dead on. I mean, it's about returning value to the shareholders, right? So shareholder value, which is the value proposition of of any commercial activity, right, is a very different thing than public stakeholder value, which is citizens' values, right? So there's already a competition or a disconnect there, right? So I mean, I don't know what it's going to take. There have been some attempts to bring the public sector or the private sector in a little bit more and get them to, again, not to make it too normative, but cooperate and participate in these areas. But the best way to get the public sector involved is to show them how they're going to lose money or their business is going to be damaged. Normally, it's around IP issues. This is why you see a lot of clothiers now and other types of producers really paying a lot of attention to ethical standards around labor. Right. So, I mean, not that the corporations have historically been the biggest supporters of labor rights. Right. I mean, we all know the history of it. But and there's all sorts of efforts, at play here. But, there's a recognition that, oh, wow, people are going to stop buying my chocolate or stop buying my clothes, if I'm seen to be a bad, player in this space. So they're incentivized now to do better and to cooperate possibly a little bit more, as well as get the return on investment for them is that positive PR that comes out of it, right? The ability to sort of try to reinforce their brand with it. And that's really, when it comes to cigarettes, alcohol, again, textiles, all these areas, this is really been the best way. And the OECD has done some really good work in here in trying to bring governments together, generally around the G40 countries and some of the larger players in this space that are at risk and could actually help. Right, the governments just don't have the ability to intervene on every single one of these cases. So it's really, it behooves these companies to be to have more of an investigative mindset and to be a bit more aware and interactive. But the biggest issue at the end of it is they find somebody has done something inside their system or has put them at risk, they are loath to share that information with the public sector because of the the reputational issues. So that's always a constraint. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, John. And a question that's linked, is the focus perhaps too much at the moment on cybersecurity to the exclusion of other aspects of hybrid warfare or other threats associated with it? And what can organizations that specialize in, for example, cybersecurity do to help create bigger awareness of the sort of the total package of the threat, the whole scope of the threats? Is there too much focus at the moment on cybersecurity?
Arguably, yes, but that's an easy criticism. Sort of the scale and the volume and the severity of attacks right now, you couldn't not pay attention to it.
Indeed.
That said, there's a lot of underappreciated merit in security to doing simple things much better than we do. We do have a tendency as an industry to not be brave enough to have conversations, common sense conversations about what could we do better. We have a lot of conversations about why we can't. We have a lot of conversations about why there isn't enough money, why we don't have enough people. And I would love to see leaders, particularly sort of C-suite leaders, push their management teams by asking simple questions, which is, if we got hit by a ransomware attack today or tomorrow, each of you, what would you be doing? And if they don't get a clear answer, that's when you know you have work to do. Because if you're well prepared, the answer is simple, because people know. And I would really love to see management in companies start having these conversations and to stop prevaricating. And it's common sense. A lot of it is common sense, because we start with what. So is there too much focus on cybersecurity? No, I don't think there's too much focus. I think it's necessary focus, but it would be a mistake to focus only on cybersecurity to the exclusion of other things. And it should be the impetus now. We should be looking at the scale, and like I say, the scale and the severity of attacks as an impetus to start sharing information differently, to behave differently. If we keep on behaving the way we're behaving right now, we're going to keep having the same results, which is trying to, put out fires after they've happened, the mixing metaphors, but bolting the stable door after the horse is bolted. So we need to do better, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be more complex. It means making better choices and being more focused and interacting differently with stakeholders in the ecosystem.
And just staying with you for the moment, you yourself are involved in consulting in the area of cybersecurity. Would you think that your peers in that sector are sufficiently equipped to advise businesses on the broader threat as well, the broader kinds of actions that might be associated with hybrid warfare that become visible in cyber attacks, but they might be invisible elements involved as well? What seems to be a straightforward commercial deal might also involve a form of hybrid warfare, while the focus is on the cybersecurity aspect, the more visible aspects of hybrid warfare. Or is it also, as John said, so specialized in your sector that people only focus on the cybersecurity element and not the bigger picture?
So at the risk of doing some people a grave injustice, for which I will apologize up front, my view on that would be, no, we're not well equipped. We have a frame of reference, which is managing business risk, proprietary risk for a business. In some sectors like financial services, where the nature of the business means that there is a relatively well understood systemic risk, that's where you start to see public sector supervisory agencies getting involved, saying, we need to share better, we need to orchestrate better, because your proprietary risk is not just your own. The banks and the nature of the financial services sector means that there are interactions and connectivity issues between institutions, the whole thing. And I'd say since maybe 2018 that this has begun to, much more of a focus for supervisory agencies. Coming back to your question about people like me, broadly, I would say no. We are asked, regardless of our employer, we are asked as consultants to serve the present needs of a particular company, and they are, I'd say in my experience, never framed in terms of considerations that go beyond the confines of that company. Even when we might be talking about advanced persistent threats that could be coming from nation state actors, we will look at it through the lens of the impact for a company. We tend not to, and I'm not shedding blame or casting aspersions on anybody. It's just a fact. We don't look at it in terms of the societal impact, what it might mean in the aggregate for a nation. It's looked at through the lens of business risk and impact, potential profit loss for a company. And my personal view is that needs to change, because even with the best of intentions of not being manipulated or instrumentalized, the reality is that people, and I refute the statement which says people are a company's weakest link. No, we need to put in place mechanisms that protect employees. We train them, make them aware, allow them to apprehend themselves the threat, and to have this idea. Well, Kel has a great saying that he borrowed from somebody else, which is, you may think that you're too small for geopolitics to care about you, but it does. And all employees, regardless of their company, their role, everybody needs to realize that this is a cause of, that is bigger than ourselves. We have to be aware of it, and to have a questioning mindset, and to wonder, and to be inquisitive, that there are things that may well impact us.
Okay, thanks, John.
I guess 3 thoughts on that. First of all, most successful cybersecurity attacks are a bolt out of the blue. They're unexpected. They're difficult to defend against. And the nature and the scope of the attacks, because they're new, because there is no means to defend against them, becomes somewhat sensationalized. And so there's a lot of public focus on that, which leads to the second point. I think there is something of a symbiotic relationship between those who are attacked, or the attackers, and the media, because the media will, of course, focus on the nature of a specific attack, saying, 200,000 bits of private information have been leaked as a result of this attack. And of course, individuals say, oh my God, am I affected? And it sort of snowballs after that. So I think the nature and the scope and the unexpected nature of cyber attacks creates something of a symbiotic relationship between the media and the nature of the attack. So it gets a lot more exposure in that respect. But I think the big difference is that while there's a tendency to focus on the specifics of an attack, the broader strategies related to hybrid warfare are not touched on to a similar degree within the media or other platforms that get to the general public. For example, you're not going to hear a lot about influence activities on the part of Russia in local media in Estonia or Belarus or Ukraine or anything along that, because they may not realize it's happening. You may not hear a lot about, Chinese influence in cultural community groups in Canada, or how they influence Chinese students who are studying in Canada, and the obligations or the pressures put on them in Canada as part of broader hybrid warfare, because there's a challenge in appreciating that particular tool when it comes to the broader nature of, or the broader span of, what constitutes a hybrid attack from a particular country. So cyber attacks, just by their nature and because of the scope, and as I said, the relationship with the media gets a lot more attention, and by virtue of that, it gets greater visibility, and governments and private sector are asked to do something. But for 80% of the other tools that are employed by states as part of their broader hybrid agendas or strategies, you hear very little about that. Not to say that they're not going on, and not to say in the case of Russia influence activities or information influence activities, they're not just as important in the long term in terms of the objectives or the strategies of hybrid warfare of individual states.
Okay. Thanks, John. Thank you very much indeed, which I think nicely leads into the next question for Veronique, let me start with you. How do we bring that awareness to executives and students via law schools, business schools, and so on? What kind of training should we be doing? What should we be doing to try and bring this awareness to the business world in particular? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Barney. I think the first thing is to, I think MBA and law students should be educated about these new threats. I remember when Chris started this project, he rarely encountered somebody that even had heard about hybrid warfare. So a lot of people, or race on conflict, a lot of people in our field, dispute resolution field, had never heard about it, didn't even know it existed. So I think first thing is to be sensibilized to the fact that it exists, and also understanding exactly what it is, what it entails. And I think one of the most important things, once you know that it can exist, is being able to recognize the signs that we are maybe facing a hybrid warfare case. So that's the first thing. Second, as part of the dispute resolution field, I focus really on negotiation. Once you're able to recognize the sign, you should be able to know what are the alternatives to negotiate. Like, is that a case that you have to engage in negotiation, or are there other alternatives? Can you go to government? Can you raise a flag? So what are the options, or you have to actually engage in negotiations? So we know that negotiation is always, it can be optional in any way. And if we choose, if we do have to negotiate, if it's a case that we have to engage in some sort of negotiation, what negotiation techniques would work? What do we do in a case like that? So I think this is what I see from the lens of our own field of dispute resolution.
Okay, thanks very much. And John, your thoughts on that?
I guess to some degree, my thoughts only emphasize what Anne and Chris have already said, and it's that the allure of easy money that serves to enhance stock prices or save a threatened industry, it's often hard for domestic-based industries or communities to resist. So how do governments compete promoting what is essentially an intangible security-related narrative that may otherwise serve as a disincentive to proceed with the deal? What's the response to business who is always going to ask, what's in it for me? When it comes to promoting strategies to counter hybrid warfare, until you're in a position to answer those kinds of questions fairly succinctly and directly, short of public shaming, which Chris touched on already, how do you culturally address those kinds of questions of what's in it for me when the students get out into the real world and they are faced with the demands from their CEOs and COOs to increase stock prices or keep the company afloat or sell 50,000 more widgets.
Yeah.
Until you're in a position to say, what's in it for me, that kind of education in a I don't want to say a sterile academic environment is probably easy to do, but when they get out into the real world, that's where the challenge is going to be. And it's the commercial industry. And I think Calvin had said early on, it's the legal industry, in my view, kind of has to look on it from a due diligence perspective to say, in the interest of the company, is this something that we need to tunnel down and take a greater look at?
Yeah, I mean, just to jump on that real quick, and I'm sorry, because one thing that really I think flows from this is ethics, right? There's business ethics need to be rethought to some extent. It's really what Anne's getting to as well. We can't expect some kid coming out of school, even with an MBA, to stand up, like David to Goliath. They're going to get eaten alive, and they'll go do something else if they survive. It has to come. It has to come through leadership from the top, as Anne suggested. And one of the things we've seen, some of the behaviors change when the courts get involved and actually really start putting real penalties on people for doing the wrong thing, for turning the blind eye. I mean, the FATF has been great for this, for money laundering, but also if we look at the cigarette industry, when they started really adding zeros to the penalties, for, well, we don't care who we wholesale our cigarettes to. It started to affect the bottom line for real, as well as the reputational side of it, because courts are very public with those verdicts. So I think and then again, this is a hard thing to do because now we're talking about public-private partnership, but we're also talking about the public sector in some ways holding the private sector more accountable. So it's a tough road.
If you have them by the purse, the hearts and minds might follow, right? Okay.
Arnie?
Yeah.
Could I just add perhaps another dimension that hasn't really been looked at in a world that I live in a lot? I often get called, and although you introduced me through the Interventus Global label of business, I also do some other stuff in terms of risk issues, and quite often get into these situations with law firms or CEOs, often as our clients right now. And quite often, they don't know the dispute that they're engaged in. They don't really understand who they're having the dispute with. It may look like there's a mouse across from the table, but there's actually an elephant across the table. And I think in a very defensive way, aside from those ethical arguments, which is like one dimension of this, and it was really what motivated me to reach out to Chris to initiate this, was I just saw so many people sitting at a boardroom table, whether they were dealing with a state kidnapping, whether they were dealing with some type of internal threat from some client that they didn't quite understand, that perhaps wasn't just a crazy person, but was maybe a state actor, whether they were in a real estate transaction with a foreign entity, for $500,000, and they were not thinking that their whole negotiation strategy with their legal team was completely transparent to the other side because of the cyber capabilities of the other party. And the list can go on and on. But I really think that business leaders, lawyers, are where most of this first response happens, and they don't even know what they're really dealing with in dealing with a dispute or a negotiation. And I think they're at a disadvantage, and the power imbalance is not even, they don't even have an awareness of what that power imbalance really is. So I think it's super, super important, also just from the negotiation dispute resolution process.
I'd like to put in a question here,
yes,
because Barney was given the role of asking the questions that we had worked out for all of our security experts. But this particular question about who should be taught this stuff and how, and whether it should be classroom material, Barney also has his own expertise in, and I think the question should be posed to you as well, Barney. You're teaching MBA students and perhaps undergraduate business students as well. I'm not sure the Belgian's construct there,
Indeed.
but you're dealing with the next generation of business executives who will have to work their way up, and they are going to start with no power. But I would ask you, what barriers do you see and what possibilities do you see for courses in this material to be created in business schools, or following what I'd call the Len Riskin model of how to teach lawyers, embedding hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict problems into courses that ostensibly are not about that for business students? What are the prospects there?
Chris, thank you. And I think it was Christopher who touched on it, that I think the one aspect is business ethics, that one should sharpen the focus on business ethics. Why should companies be doing the right thing? Now, there are two arguments: because it is the right thing to do, or it's because in their own interests. What's in it for me? So the challenge is to make out a case to say whether you think it's the right thing to do, or whether you do it for your own self-interest, you ought to be doing this and this and this. And probably because it will affect your pocket, you know, even if it's the right thing to do, it will be, in any event, the best thing to do for you as a business. So I think refocusing teaching on business ethics. The other aspect, and at Fleur, this is what we are busy doing. We can also link it to basic business philosophy. And I think until the Milton Friedman's idea of the business is there to take care of its shareholders, until that idea is dead and buried finally, and people start talking about the role of the business is to look beyond just the shareholders to the society at large as well. I think that also has to be addressed, and the emphasis on sustainability, I think, is at the moment the right angle to take there. More and more companies talking about sustainability, looking at stakeholder interests, not just the shareholder interests. So I think what one can do is package business courses, both for executives and for MBA students, that specifically focus on this, but not on its own, but as part of sustainability, as part of business ethics, as part of risk management. If one can link it to any of those topics, I think it starts making business sense. But you can't go and preach it as the right thing to do for the sake of society only. I think there are very few businesses will buy into the idea only for that reason. It's back to the old thing of what's in it for us. What we're doing at Fleric is pretty much incorporating these things now, and I think the cases that we're busy developing in the different teams will certainly assist a great deal to create that awareness. At business school level, it's quite easy to create awareness by using cases. I think it might be a little bit more difficult at law school to do so, but at business school, it becomes a bit easier to create that awareness because of the way one teaches there. But thanks, Chris. Thanks very much. We need to start wrapping up. I mean, allow some time for questions.
Can I make a comment? This is Roy Lewicki.
Roy, yes, please. Roy, can I say, let's open it for questions right now. So Roy, please go ahead.
I'm retired teaching from a business school. And I would have two reactions as to, the first is that the structure of business school education is to segment all the pieces of managing a business into separate courses that don't talk, rarely talk to each other. So accounting and finance and marketing and statistics and whatever all have different, have their own lenses, their own frames. We're sort of looking at a business problem and pulling it apart with using the tools with that particular lens. What you're suggesting, what I hear being talked about here, is an integrative or a broader frame that brings many perspectives together. And quite frankly, that's been a major failure of business education, is the capacity to be able to do that. In other words, to restructure the curriculum so that multiple perspectives on the same problem can be taken and understood. The second thing I would say is that it's, how do I express this? I lost the point. I'll come back to it. Oh, I know. Yeah. You were talking about business ethics. I mean, business ethics is one example of another frame, okay, that will come at as a business problem. I find it when I taught business ethics and leadership ethics in the business school for at least a decade. The hardest thing it is to do is to get people to understand that that's an appropriate lens for looking at a problem and understanding that lens suggests action strategies which accounting or finance or law or something else should not understand, should not be able to do it, not work on. So again, my point here is there understanding these complex problems requires a series of integrating or showing how multiple perspectives work on the same problem. And business education has not been well suited to do that for a whole variety of reasons regarding the way it gets taught. I don't know how the political science or psychology do that, but I think maybe I'm not confident about business.
Maybe I'm in a fortunate position at our school. We teach particular themes and bring faculty from different disciplines in, for example, around sustainability. And that includes then issues of the UN development goals. It includes issues of ethics. It includes issues of corporate social responsibility and so on. So there's certainly an effort to do that. And I agree with you. That's probably the only way to do it is to start getting faculty to actually coalesce around particular themes that can incorporate the kind of things we're talking about. Sandra, your hand was up, and then Chris Corpora after that. Sandra?
Yeah, so hate to say, but planners and environmental studies people are slightly ahead on this because our students have practicum and capstone experiences where they treat a subject and bring in different expertises. Barney sounds like he's doing that too. But for us, it's been a tradition, and we actually have to. You can't treat a planning issue as if it were a business, right? It's a totally different thing. It's in the public domain with multiple stakeholders who all have a say and voice. And so we do that all the time, and we bring in, I mean, there's a standard list of who you need to bring in on a consensus building problem. It always includes scientists, but it also includes various specific transportation and other aspects that are specialized but brought together for the specific topic. So anytime you want to hear more about that, I'm here to tell you about it.
Thanks. Thanks very much indeed. Chris?
Yeah, no, I've taught the last 5 years, off and on, but full time last 5 years, and generally in the international security space and some unique places, but still the whole siloed approach to understanding even just international security or international politics is problematic. It has to be more multidisciplinary, the approach, and we have to start recognizing the relationships between some of these these sectors or silos that that we've kind of created over time. And I think there needs to be a movement not away from specialization, but a balance between specialization and general knowledge. We don't spend enough time giving our students a foundation, a really solid foundation, as well as at the end a capstone that brings it all together and forces them to see sort of the ugly truth of how complex some of this really can be. And I think that's I know a lot of programs try to do this, but I think it's one of the best things you can do for your students. Spend maybe a little bit more time at that foundational level and make sure they really get a solid capstone at the back end. Certainly in international security, that's effective.
And when it comes to complex conflicts, I think we have to at least get some idea about what's the beginning set of analytical tools that you want a student or a group of students to come at that situation with. There's gotta, you've got to, I don't know how you start pulling the strings apart and seeing what's there without some primitive set of tools or whatever for analyzing, whether it's a stakeholder analysis, whether it's a multi-group interest-based negotiation, whatever it might be. I would not want to go much more than two or three classes with students in order to be able to give them some help as to what approaches or perspectives are most useful for at least beginning to pull that situation apart and understand it more thoroughly.
Is that accomplished really by bringing academic and practitioners together as opposed to just academics in an academic society?
Well, listening to the four of you who are practitioners, I'm trying to listen for that, for what you know, analytically, how do you come at these situations? And I've got a little hint of that, but I think that kind of collaboration would be very critical.
Yeah.
I'd like to pose a question that takes off from this idea of collaboration, because as sort of somebody with a bit of a laboring oar attitude toward this project, I've been thinking about, you know, the fact that every time I'm involved in one of these projects, it's always trying at least to be out in front of the discussion, which results in relatively small groups of people who understand that we even have a discussion going and that they ought to be interested. It's a later phase when people start to show interest in the subject. And I mean, you're to that. But in this instance, I'd like to pose a question to everybody, but it's drawn from separate things that Anne and John were saying. And it's my sort of rudimentary attempt to start to think about mitigation of harm. Who do we work with? Who can we work with for the future? This is really early for this part of the discussion, but I'd just like to put it out there because you've triggered it this morning. Two possibilities for getting past the one firm at a time, rather, you know, what's in it for me as a firm right now mentality in the private sector that struck me as you were talking as at least worth drawing up the question of whether they might be interested. When private firms want to act in concert on some kind of problem that they perceive, and that requires that they perceive it, of course, as long as it's not, you know, an antitrust or other illegal combination, they tend to do this through industry associations. And because that's an established structure that most industries have one of, and because a lot of those associations tend to have offices in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, it raises the question, are we overlooking a possible ally here? That's one question. And the parallel question that struck me as John was talking was whether we're overlooking the insurance industry as a potential ally. Because I don't know a lot about the insurance industry. It's not heavily unionized, and I've never dealt with labor disputes in it, which is how I know about some other industries. But in the reading that I've done, I have the impression that the really core insurance companies, not the ones that you and I might buy a policy from, but companies like Chubb, are engaged in insuring against big business risks. And when you started talking about risk management being a possible focus, that raised the question, are we overlooking a possible group of allies there?
That's a really interesting point on the insurance sector, because no later than last week, there's been some developments within that industry where they've been coming together, so insurance companies coming together as a grouping to put together a tool to actually aggregate data across the sector with in regards to ransomware, and also to educate. Now, this is where there is a beneficial aspect to what's in it for me, right? Because it is in the insurance company's best interest to educate so that the level of cyber hygiene is higher, so that the incidence of claims is lower. Because the thing about ransomware is that it's been used as a quick fix to mitigate a business risk. But the nature of ransomware is actually different to a lot of risks that are insured or insurable, which is it could potentially be catastrophic across all companies. There could be a cataclysmic ransomware event that you can't insure against. And where the insurance industry is struggling is that finding underwriters, A, absence of historical data to cost the risk, B, the nature of the risk means that, well, does anybody really want to underwrite it? So what's interesting is not to say we're no longer going to insure this risk, but to make it a manageable risk. So absolutely, yeah, totally. I think there's a very interesting strand there around orchestrating better with the insurance industry.
And it wasn't long after 9/11 that Mead bought Kroll, right? Mead Insurance Company bought Kroll Security, one of the largest security companies at the time. I mean, just bought it whole cloth. I mean, so I think that there's been interest in that sector for quite a while in these problems as they've sort of spun out.
It seems to me that the society might be getting ripe for a new version of something that's really a very old insurance industry convention, because if you buy any kind of electrical appliance, at least in the United States, and you look at the plug that it comes with, it will probably have a paper tag on it with a number and the words Underwriters Laboratories. And that relates to an insurance industry structure which was basically imposed on the electrical industry, that they were going to have to prove that the design of a product that was known to cause fires would be safe. And they were going to have to run all those products through Underwriters Laboratories. And it's so routinized, nobody thinks about it. Well, you know, it's been a century since that system has existed. Perhaps we are looking at the possibility of a new equivalent of that, again, that deals with new kinds of risks.
All right, thanks, Chris Sunder. Very briefly, then we wrap up.
Yes,
Cal,
very
I think your hand
briefly.
was still up as well.
Yes, I
Sorry.
loved Anne's expression of cyber hygiene. And the other day I was thinking, how come companies do not actually engage in basic instincts, such as actually Chris mentioned too, of cyber hygiene? I could think of a few cold, and I'm amazed that they don't. And then the answer is it probably costs money and they just don't want to be bothered. It is the minimalist, no redundancy approach. And that's what also ruins our electrical grid and various other systems where we go minimalistic for cost reasons. But that's a short-sighted approach, and we need to take the longer view of it's going to cost a lot more when it hits, right? So yeah, I'd like to keep this concept of cyber hygiene as one of the things we focus on.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, all. Let me just briefly wrap up my understanding. I think as far as the definitional aspect is concerned, I think there was consensus in the panel that one shouldn't be too dogmatic about it. And perhaps rather focus on the kinds of activities that are typically associated with hybrid warfare and focus on those and not be too focused on finding the holy grail of the perfect definition. Everybody agreed that a key component of hybrid warfare is the involvement of a state actor, but that of course does not exclude the use of non-state actors as part of the broader hybrid warfare strategy. Then also, I think there was a strong sense that to combat hybrid warfare, a multi-pronged approach is needed that involves not only the security agencies and governments, but also the private sector. And I think there was a general consensus that came out that none of the agencies or the private sector are on their own equipped to deal with this because of various reasons, one being high levels of specialization, siloed thinking, siloed way of operating, and so on. Anne made the point that John mentioned that what we need is a whole sector response, and said it's actually a question of an all nation response, but with leadership also in business being part of the beginning of a strategy to manage hybrid warfare. And that took the discussion into how does one get business to become more interested in this? And what's in it for me is the key question. I think towards the end, some ideas came out about how one can entice business, maybe through the insurance sector, to actually take these things seriously. But as educators, we also have a role to play, and especially with business students, to create that awareness, whether it's done as part of business ethics or any other component of the MBA programs, but to start creating that awareness among our students as well. Can I start off by just thanking Noam, Titania, Roy, thank you so much, Sandra, for your inputs and attendance. Titania, we haven't heard from you, but hopefully it was interesting for you as well. And then, of course, to the panel, Kel, thank you so much. You've been involved in this from the start. Thank you so much. Anne, great to have you on board as well. John, thank you so much to you and Christopher. Good to meet both of you. Thank you for your inputs and expertise in this as well. And then my colleagues, Chris and Veronique, thank you so much for your cooperation. I wish you all well for the rest of the day, and hope to be in touch. If not soon, then probably at the conference in somewhere in Canada next year.